Brethren, we live in a world that has been very rapidly changing. And we think about that and comment on that from time to time. This past Thursday, I was at Bible study down in the Lufkin area and talking with one of the men. And we were just talking, I got to sort of talking about some of the things, the changes that have happened just over recent decades, and certainly in his lifetime, many of those same things I've seen, and we just got to talking about how totally different the world is now from the world in which our parents grew up. And I think we all recognize that. It's the world that we live in has undergone a period of rapid change. In fact, it's been the period of most dramatic change in history. Back in Daniel chapter 12, Daniel 11 records this vision that Daniel was given, and there are references to the time of the end. And as we come into chapter 12, it just continues the thought at that time of the end, talks about a time of trouble such as never has been. That, of course, is what we call the Great Tribulation, a time that Jesus made reference to. In fact, quoting this very phrase, or paraphrasing it, when Jesus talked about in Matthew 24, there will come a time of trouble such as has not been since the world began. And that's what Daniel refers to here. And then at the conclusion of that, the latter part of verse 1, at that time your people shall be delivered. And then we're told in verse 2, many of those that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awaken. So we're looking at the time of the resurrection. Now, when people wake up, there will be those who awaken the first resurrection to everlasting life. And Christ talked about that, inspired the Apostle John to write of it in Revelation 20, when he described, blessed and holy is he that has part in the first resurrection. On such the second death has no power. They're resurrected to immortality, to everlasting life. Now, later on, there are those who will come up, and they will be resurrected to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who have an opportunity to know and understand the truth and turn their back on it, shame and everlasting contempt. What a stupid choice. What a crazy decision. What insane thinking. To have an opportunity to be part of the family of God and to throw it away for whatever reason. We sometimes look at the story of Esau and how Esau sold his birthright for a bowl of soup, a bowl of porridge. And you look at that and you think, boy, you talk about dumb. I mean, there have been some bad deals that have been made down through time. But Esau sold his birthright for a bowl of soup. I don't know, maybe he got seconds out of it. He could go back to one of these all-you-can-eat buffets. But regardless of how many bowls he got out of the deal, within a matter of hours, you know what, Esau was hungry again, and the birthright was gone. We look at that and we say, how crazy, how stupid to throw away something that has potential on out into the future, on and on and on. Throw it away for just immediate gratification. And yet how many people, all the way down till now, do the same thing? They trade the future for the immediate gratification of the moment. Well, those who do that are going to wake up to shame and everlasting contempt. Those that are wise will shine as the brightness of the firmament. They will be like the sun, the moon, the stars. Daniel then was told, verse 4, you, O Daniel, shut up the words, seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. Now you find that Daniel wanted to understand verse 8. He heard some of these statements, but he didn't understand them. And he said, what shall be the end of these things? How is this exactly all going to wrap up? He was told in verse 9, go your way, Daniel. The words are closed up and sealed until the time of the end. You realize Daniel wrote things in this book that he himself did not fully understand. It was written and sealed up until the time of the end. I think it's very interesting in verse 4 how the time of the end is defined. What is characteristic? Sealed to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. Has there ever been a time like the last 100 years? You know, we're right now in the year 2003. We're celebrating the centennial of flight. The Wright brothers made their first flight 100 years ago. And, of course, as impressive as that was, it wasn't really much of a flight. It took one of these huge military transport aircraft. The flight the Wright brothers took wouldn't have even taken them from nose to tail. One of these great big aircraft. It just was a very short little flight that they took, sort of a hop, but it was something more than anybody else had done, and it was the first one. And in the aftermath of that, within a few years, there were much longer flights being made, and particularly at the time of World War I and in the aftermath, things really began to take off. You know, you go back and you realize that for most of human history, people basically got somewhere by walking, by riding on an animal, or by riding in something pulled by an animal. And that continued all the way up into the 20th century. You know, that's not ancient history. I remember my grandmother, the only one of my grandparents that I ever knew, and she lived with us when I was growing up, and lived to be up in her very late 80s before she died. She was born back in the latter part of the 19th century. And she was a little girl, about 4 years old. By that time, both of her parents had died within a matter of a few months of one another. And she had an uncle, her father's brother, who news was sent to him. She and her family had lived up in the hills of Arkansas, and he lived in Mississippi. Word got to him, and he saddled up his mule, because after all, this was about 1889 or 1890. He saddled up his mule, and he rode all the way up there to where she and her sisters were, and hitched up his mule to his brother's wagon, and I guess used his brother's mule as well, and hitched up the two mules to the wagon, and put a feather bed in the back of the wagon, and that was the transportation for my grandmother and her three sisters as they rode back to Mississippi. Now, the journey they took was not some huge, long journey, but it took her uncle 6 weeks to make the round trip. And that wasn't unusual, or that wasn't unique. Because back at that point in time, if you wanted to go somewhere, that was the way you went. Now, I remember that because heard the story, and I remember a number of years later when my grandmother by this time was into her 80s, and in 1969, in July of 1969, an event that many of us remember took place, and that was the first moon landing. The lunar landing. First man walked on the moon. And, you know, you think about that in the lifetime, not only of my grandmother, but of many, many thousands of other people whose life had stretched. Let's face it, if you were 70 years old at that point, your life had begun before the Wright brothers' first flight. And in the course of one lifetime of 70 years, the entire history of flight had developed. Everything from the first flight of the Wright brothers all the way to the landing on the moon. Now, that's an incredible amount of change to take place in a period of 66 years between the Wright brothers and the moon landing. I don't think my grandmother ever really believed they landed on the moon. That seemed too far-fetched to her, and I think she figured it was just some TV show. But you know, you think about people who lived during that time period and through much of the 20th century, certainly on up to the time period, even in rural areas. If you look at the time before World War II, you're often looking at a time before there was any electricity and when farming was primarily done with animals. You know, if Abraham had been resurrected into a rural area back in the early part of the 20th century, in the 1920s, or even in the 1930s, many rural areas, if he'd just suddenly been resurrected and come up in that world, it would not have been a world that he couldn't have understood, because in a lot of rural areas, people were still getting their water by drawing it out of a well. They were still farming by plowing behind an animal, pushing a plow. They went somewhere by walking or riding on their horse or riding in a wagon pulled by a horse. He would have certainly noticed differences. He would have noticed, improvements, quote, in technology. Maybe they made the plow a little bit better or a little different. He would have noticed differences. But it would not have been a world that he could not have comprehended if he had come up or were to come up just a matter of a few decades later. The world today would be absolutely incomprehensible when you look at the things that we take for granted. In fact, many of our young people today, if they were to suddenly be transported in time back just to the world in which their grandparents grew up, it would be totally different, just almost incomprehensible, because you can be in a rural area today. It's not just the cities. You can be in a rural area and you can have access to the internet. You can surf the web, and you can watch who knows how many television channels if you want to pay for the or by satellite or something. You've got access to all of these things. Just the incredible technology. Daniel was told, many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. That applies to what we went through in the 20th century in a way that you can find no other comparable period of time in the history of man. There was change down through time, but change was slow. It was incremental. And the world into which many people were born was not that much different from the world in which they died and the world in which their parents and their grandparents had been born. You just go back through the centuries and you find that for most of mankind's history, in fact, if we had a chart up here on the wall, we've got all these pictures up here, just pretend that we had a piece of paper up here that was 5 feet long, 60 inches, and we had it marked off in big marks, 60 inches, and you had each inch marked off. Do you realize that 5-foot piece of paper with each inch visibly marked off, that each inch would represent 1 century in the entire, that would represent the entire 6,000 years of human history, and each inch would represent a century. Do you realize you would be all the way down to the last inch before the first automobile or the first airplane? You had basically 59 out of the 60 inches where there was no such thing. Or you could go back maybe a half an inch earlier than that, or 3/4 of an inch, and find the first steamboat and the first railroad train. Just absolutely incredible when you look at it in that context and realize what a tiny, short period of time, the technology that you and I take for granted. Do we live in a time when many shall run to and fro and knowledge shall be increased? The distances that all of us traveled for Sabbath services today. My wife and I got up and went to Lufkin this morning for the service there, and then came back through here. Some of you came from fairly close, and some of you maybe from 5, 10, 15, 20 miles, 50 miles, more. That would have been unthinkable not too many decades ago. Just the ability to make a quick trip like that on the Sabbath, you couldn't have done that. So we live in a time of very rapid change. And that was prophesied. But not only is there technological change, a transportation revolution, a knowledge explosion. The technology is increasing so rapidly. Look at the computer, that it hasn't been that many years ago that nobody ever thought in terms of having a personal computer. I remember when I went to Ambassador College back in the 60s, they had just a short time before, a couple of years earlier, I had installed this great big IBM computer system to keep up with the mailing list. And they had rooms, a huge room that was filled with great big massive machines. And they had to have special floor in there because of running all the wires through there and special air conditioning and filters to keep the, dust from getting in there and messing it up. This huge system. Boy, that was impressive. Today, most of us have in our homes something that is pretty small. I've got a little laptop computer. My laptop will do far more than that big IBM system that we had years ago. We thought it was so impressive. Well, it was impressive, but it's so far obsolete today. And the technology of today, you think that's impressive. Just let time go on, and a lot of things that we're familiar with, you give 10, 15, 20 years, and it'll be obsolete. It doesn't take that long. They sort of build the obsolescence in. They want you to buy a new one, and they keep coming out with new programs, and a lot of it does stuff that you don't need, but that's what's out there. So we live in a world of technology, a world of rapid transportation, rapid knowledge explosion, and that was prophesied for the end time. But understand something else that also prophesied for the end time. We live in a world of change that's not just change in technology. We live in a world of change in terms of morals and ethics that is just as rapid and is very destabilizing. And the whole nature of this very changing world is destabilizing. Traditional societies and communities where people grew up and generation after generation, whatever changes were made were slow and were incremental. Today, drastic change takes place in just one lifetime and one generation. And one of the things, of course, that we've seen is it affects the entire society. And that was prophesied too. We commented just a matter of a few weeks ago, the U.S. Supreme Court made a ruling that invalidated the Texas sodomy law. Now, I think the interesting thing is if you go back to 1960, every single state in the Union had the same law. Every state. All of them weren't 50 yet, I guess. Or right, that was about the time we moved from 48 to 50. All the states had that same law. Up in Canada, right around that same time, a little bit before that, the Canadian Supreme Court invalidated marriage law in Canada that defined marriage as between one man and one woman and said, well, that's discriminatory. You can't discriminate. What if a couple of women want to get married? A couple of men want to get married. I don't know, if they thought the thing through. Where do you stop? Where do you stop discriminating? Well, if one guy wants to marry a whole bunch of women, one woman wants to marry a whole bunch of men, the point being, the Prime Minister of Canada, Jacques Chrétien, made the statement. He talked about, when they asked him for comment on this, he said, well, we live in a time of evolving community standards. Evolving community standards. Now, that's what he called it. Right. Before services, I was handed an advertisement that came out of a magazine advertising a new television show. This is on Bravo. If you have a satellite or cable, I guess you can get Bravo. And the name of the show is Queer Eye on the Straight Guy. Only on Bravo. 5 gay men out to make over the world, one straight guy at a time. Now what? This is a new TV show. It premieres 10 p.m. Tuesday, July the 15th. Don't have Bravo? Well, contact your cable or satellite provider. Now, we're not talking about something that is unknown or off in some remote corner. We're talking about things that are being openly advertised. You hear about one of the latest nominees that President Bush nominated for the Federal Court of Appeals. He nominated the Attorney General of Alabama. Well, the Attorney General of Alabama is really drawing a lot of fire. There are a lot of folks there in the Senate that are all upset. He did a terrible thing, and it looks like it's going to cost him his appointment to the Federal Appeals Court. You know the terrible thing that he did? He, back, I don't know when it was, a number of months ago, he was scheduled to go on vacation. He was planning on going on vacation, and he had some children at home, and they had planned on making a trip down to Florida, down to visit Disney World in Orlando. And so that was where they were going, and I guess right before he took off on his trip, he somehow found out that the particular day that he had scheduled to go to Disney World and take his family was Gay Pride Day at Disney World. And so they were having, all the homosexuals were there, and that was going to be that day they were particularly being catered to, and that was Gay Pride Day at Disney World. And so for some strange reason, he decided that wasn't where he wanted to take his family that day. He changed his plans and went somewhere else. Now, maybe you didn't realize that that's just almost criminal. I mean, that is terrible that somebody would do a thing like that. Well, you got senators that are outraged that somebody could possibly be on a federal court that didn't want to take his kids to Disney World on Gay Pride Day. Now, the thing I think we ought to consider is you don't have to go back very many years to a time when it would have been just the opposite. Boy, if something had been found out about a politician like that would have been the kiss of death. We live in a time that, as the Prime Minister of Canada said, evolving community standards. Well, God describes it a little different way. If you want to go back to 2 Timothy, chapter 3, verse 1. 2 Timothy 3:1. This know also that in the last days perilous times shall come. Dangerous times. Not only are we living in a time when knowledge is increased and men are running to and fro, not only are we living in a time of a technological revolution, a transportation revolution, a knowledge explosion, we're also living in what God says, inspired the Apostle Paul to write in his letter to Timothy, are perilous times, dangerous times. He goes on and describes a society that is self-indulgent. Men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy. That's pretty descriptive. Very self-indulgent, very materialistic. Blasphemers, unholy. The language that is being utilized regularly in television and the movies is just increasingly raw and vulgar and blasphemous. There was a time when you would never have heard on television or in a movie God's name openly taken in vain. Oh, they may have used some euphemisms, but to just come right out and blatantly do that sort of thing, the kind of language that is routinely used. Yet, we live in a time where that's being increasingly taken for granted. That's considered normal. You read, a lot of novels or books, maybe, quote, bestsellers. They're selling multiple thousands of copies, and the characters in there routinely are using every sort of vulgar expression and every sort of blasphemous expression. And that is something that, that's characteristic of the society, and that's what Paul said. Without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good. Well, now that's pretty interesting. That just like the fellow that's been nominated for the Federal Appeals Court, he didn't want to take his kids down to Gay Pride Day at Disney World, and so he is absolutely despised by some who are even high in government. Traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof, denying the authority thereof. From such turn away. They're described as ever learning, never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Verse 7. Notice in verse 13, Paul describes evolving community standards. Here's what he said. Evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. Oh, Paul didn't say that they were evolving, that they were getting better somehow. That's the concept that what God calls degeneration. Many of the leaders in this world want to call societal evolution. Boy, everything is evolving. It's getting bigger and better and more complex and greater and grander. God said, people are waxing worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. He went on to tell Timothy, continue you in the things which you have learned and have been assured of, knowing of whom you have learned them. From a child you've known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise unto salvation through faith which is in Christ Jesus. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God. It's profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness. We live in a world of rapid change. Not just technological change, but moral change. We live in a society that is turbulent, a society that is in transition, a society that by the very rapid nature of all of the changes taking place has served to destabilize many people, to destabilize life. Because, a lot of people feel like, I guess I got to keep up with the times. I used to not do this or that, but, it looks like that's sort of the accepted thing. I want to be modern. I want to sort of fit in. I don't want to be considered an old fogey, so I better keep up with the times. Well, if you keep up with the times, how long are you going to keep up with them? And how far are you going to follow them? It's going to wax worse and worse. There is a basis of permanence in an unstable, ever-changing world. And Paul told Timothy what that was. He said, look, you're going to see society change. You're going to see things get worse and worse. But what you need to do is continue in the things that you have learned and have been assured of. What was the source of what Timothy really knew and had been assured of? Well, it went back to what he had learned from childhood, from the Bible, from the Holy Scriptures. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God. There is a basis of something that is permanent in a world that is in transition, that is in a very rapid time of turmoil and change. Many places that we could go and look, because you see, change does not always mean progress. Progress means you're heading in a forward direction. You're getting better. You're progressing. But change isn't automatically progress. You can put a car in reverse just as easily as you can put it in forward. The fact that things are changing doesn't mean that they're getting better. Now, there are changes that are for the better, and there are changes that are for the worse. The only way you have a means of distinguishing the changes that are for the better is that you have a source of stability in an unstable, ever-changing world. The Apostle John wrote in the book of 1 John, chapter 2, 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15, he said, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Now, is he talking about the people of the world? Is he talking about you shouldn't care about people? No. He's talking about the attitudes that are the underlying basis of the culture in our society. Because notice how he defines the world as he's using the term here in verse 16. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, it's not of the Father, but is of the world. So he's talking about a set of values that's based on lust and pride. Self-indulgence. You see, the world passes away. Not only is the world in turmoil and a time of great change, but you know the world itself is in transition, and this society is not going to endure. The world passes away, and the lust thereof, the values that are the basis of our society, that's going to be relegated to the trash bin, to the ash heap of history. He that does the will of God abides forever. Paul told Timothy, continue in the things you've learned. Remember where you learned it. Go back to the time when you were a child and you learned from the Bible, from the Scriptures. Because there is a basis of stability and permanence in a world that is in transition, a world that is in turmoil. And we can see these things in the society around us. If you go back to the book of Isaiah, chapter 33, Isaiah 33, verses 5 and 6. The Eternal is exalted. He dwells on high. He's filled Zion with judgment and righteousness. And wisdom and knowledge shall be the stability of your times, and strength of salvation. And the fear of the Eternal is His treasure. Now, there's a time coming when God will be exalted, when He'll fill Zion with righteousness and judgment. It will be a time of stability, and what will provide that stability? Wisdom and knowledge shall be the stability of your time. See, that's why Paul told Timothy, he said, remember, continue in the things you've learned and been assured of. Continue in the things that are permanent. Remember, from childhood, you learned God's Word. Because God's Word points toward permanence. Now, what we see around us in the physical sphere, in the human realm, is by its nature transitory. You look at everything in the physical realm, and it's in the process of changing. All we've got to do is look in the mirror, and we realize we're changing. You look at an old picture, going back. Sometimes people will get out old piece photos or something that was, back maybe 10 or 12 years ago, and they're looking back through there. And of course, one of the things you usually quickly notice is, doesn't he look so much younger back then? I'd forgotten he had that much hair, or it was that color, or whatever it was. We look at some of these. We look at these pictures, and of course, you're amazed at how quickly they change. And we notice, with a little baby, you notice it within just a few weeks. And with someone who's a little older, maybe you don't notice it every few weeks, but you certainly can notice it in a period of a few years. When you look at the physical realm, of course, everything is running down, isn't it? We're growing older. And the only sure thing you can say about every human being is that they're in the process of dying. Right? I mean, when a little baby is born, that's the one thing you know. You don't know if he's going to be rich or poor. You don't know if he's going to live for a real long time or a real short time. What you know is that his life is going to be temporary. It's going to be temporary. It's not just going to go on and on and on. The only way we're going to have life that goes on and on and on is as a miraculous gift from God. Because of and by ourselves, we're mortal. We're running down. You know, you have a pot of water that's boiling hot. Set it out on the table or just set it somewhere, and of course what happens? Well, that heat begins to leave, and it begins to cool down. You take something that you set something in motion, you know, whether the pendulum of a clock or whatever it is, you set it in motion. And it's going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And it may, if it's well balanced, it may go back and forth a little longer, but you know what? Gradually slows down. Sooner or later it stops. Because the natural human sphere, things are running down. Romans 8, we're told that God has made the entire creation subject to vanity, as the King James translates it. It just means subject to being transitory or temporary. The creation is designed as temporary, and it's going to be redeemed from what is called the bondage of corruption. You know, the new heavens and the new earth will endure forever. Now, the present heavens and the present earth would not endure forever. You know, I don't know. Scientists can argue about how long would it take for the sun to eventually burn itself out. Well, I'm not really worried about that. That's because long before that time there will be a new heavens and a new earth. But what we find is that on the human level, things change. And the tendency of natural change is a degeneration, a deterioration. You know, trees grow, and that's impressive, but I don't care how big and impressive the tree looks. If you wait enough time, sooner or later it's going to die. And if it's not harvested and made into lumber or used for something, it'll fall there, it'll rot, it'll decay, and eventually it just goes right back to the dirt that's there, and other trees come along. Even the rocks, which seem pretty permanent, even the rocks gradually erode and wear away. The natural tendency of the physical creation is deterioration. Gradually it wears away. Gradually it runs down. And we see the same tendency from let's say, a moral and an ethical standpoint. You know, sometimes there are things that can contribute to the wrong kind of change, and sometimes they're the, quote, good things of life. You know, if you go back to the story of Solomon, you remember, we're not told exactly how old Solomon was when he began his reign. I think if you go through the chronology of David's life, it's pretty apparent that Solomon was not out of his teens. Because as you look at the story of what went on in David's life prior to the sin with Bathsheba, we know that David assumed the throne when he was 30, reigned for 40 years. He assumed the throne, but the first 7 years were in Hebron. He didn't really rule over the combined nation from Jerusalem except for the last 33 years of his reign. He was 37 when he assumed the throne in Jerusalem. And as you go on through those years and just read the story there in 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles and put it together, and you look at where Bathsheba came in, realize Solomon was not the first child, because the first child that David and Bathsheba had died, and Solomon was conceived and born at a little later time. So as you put the story together, you come up with the idea that Solomon must have probably been in his late teens at the time when David died. And that ties in with the statement that David made as he was preparing and getting everything ready for Solomon to assume the throne. And we read about the preparation for the temple. And David makes the statement about his son. He said, you know, I'm doing all this because my son Solomon is young and tender. Young and tender. And as you read the story about Solomon, when God came to him in a dream soon after he had taken over as king, God came to him in a dream and said, in effect, Solomon, what would you like? And Solomon asked for wisdom. And he says, I'm just like a little child, and I've got this great nation to rule over, and I need help. Give me wisdom. Be a good king. God was pleased with that request, and God blessed him in that way. Well, Solomon set out, and he built the temple, and he built the palace, and he built great things. Great, impressive ruler. But, as the story goes on, that wasn't by any means the end of the story. Because we're told in 1 Kings 11 and verse 1, King Solomon loved many strange women, together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, and Hittites. God had instructed, don't go into those women. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And notice here in verse 4, it came to pass when Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after other gods. And his heart was not perfect with the eternal, as was the heart of David his father. Solomon went after Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Zidonians, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and he didn't go fully after the eternal, as did David his father. He built a high place for Chemosh and for Molech. And he did for all his strange wives. You see, Solomon changed, didn't he? Did all of Solomon's abundance, did all of the blessings and the benefits that he had, did they all ensure that Solomon became closer and closer to God with every passing year? No. One of the things we have to realize is that it's very easy to change to fit in with the world. What is difficult is to change to get further from the world. Sometimes we think we're doing pretty good because we're not changing as rapidly as the world is. We're going downstream, but we're going downstream at a slower pace. I remember back years ago when some of the things that were happening back in worldwide were going on, and I had someone who made the comment to me, said, well, the problem is they're just changing everything too fast. And I said, no, that's not the problem. The problem is that they're going the wrong direction. The problem is not that they're doing it too fast. The problem is they're going the wrong way. If you're going the wrong way, whether you go slowly or rapidly, it's irrelevant because you're going to wind up at the same place. We live in a world that is changing. And if we're just sort of a little bit behind the tide, we're not nearly keeping up with the world. It's very easy to drift in life. I learned a lesson about that many years ago when I first went out to Ambassador College, right at the beginning of our, first week of our freshman year. We had a sort of a get-acquainted picnic and beach party. And I'd never been to the beach before, never been to the ocean before. There's not a whole lot of ocean to see in North Louisiana. If I'd seen a lake or two, I'd seen Toledo Bend. I thought that was a lot of water. You get out there and you come up to the Pacific Ocean and you look out and it's a whole new dimension. Well, one thing about swimming in a pond or a swimming pool is you don't have to worry about some tide coming along and taking you. Well, we were there and in a particular area, and they had volleyball set up, and they had various things, and I was out, and I was just going. I thought I was just going sort of back and forth, you see, out in the water and enjoying the water, and as a little time passed, eventually I looked up, and the area of the beach that I saw looked unfamiliar. And I couldn't see anybody that I recognized. And I began to get concerned and wonder what happened. I didn't think, they'd all gotten in the bus and driven away. And eventually I looked, and way back up the beach, I saw what looked like the Ambassador College bus. Now, I didn't have any intention of going, down the coast. I was just, going back and forth, enjoying the water. What I didn't realize, of course, was that there was a tide. And it was gradually, I was being carried along. And I wasn't even aware of how much I was carried along. In fact, if it hadn't been that there was something permanent, because the bus was parked and it wasn't moving. So there was a permanent marker, there was a means of knowing where we were supposed to be. Because I could see where we were supposed to be, where I used to be, well, then I could just walk back up the coast and get back up there where everybody else was. And sure enough, there was the volleyball nets, and there was the bus, and there were all the folks. I had been drifting. That's very easy to happen in life. You don't realize you're drifting. There's only one way to recognize that you're drifting. And that is that you have a permanent marker. And you can look back at that permanent marker and say, oops, I'm not there. The only way you can prevent drift is you have to be able to spot something permanent. And then that becomes your reference point to evaluate where you need to be. Now, we have something permanent. That's what Paul told Timothy. He said, look, evil men and seducers are going to wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. The world around you, Timothy, is going to change. And it's going to change for the worse. But he said, what you need to do is continue in the things that you've learned and have been assured of. Remember, from childhood, you learned God's way. You learned the Scriptures. There is something permanent in this life. And that permanence is what comes from God. It's God's Word. God's way of life, the Ten Commandments, that's perfect. Now, you look around at the world, and because they really don't understand, you look at the changes that have taken place just in terms of society. You look around, for instance, in our society, and you see that virtually all the stores and all the various places, everything's wide open on Sundays. There was a time when that wasn't the case. Now, why did people change? Was it because they looked into the Scriptures and found out that Sunday was really not, holy time, and that was a day for work and secular activity, and so it'd be great to, have all these ball games and all these other that the work week would start? No, that's not why they changed. They just sort of drifted along, basically by materialism, because it's not like, they started closing on the Sabbath. See, they discovered they'd been closing on the wrong day. No, they just sort of drift into the fact, we can make more money if we're open 7 days rather than 6 days. And so there is a drift, there is a pressure, and people go along, not because they have been convinced from the right source that they may need to make a change. Their changes are the result of drifting along with the rest of society. I think it's very important as we look at life and as we look at our circumstances, because we realize that we live in a world of change, but that some of that change, there's a contrast that God draws. 2 Corinthians chapter 4. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16. And Paul says, for which cause we faint not, but though our outward man perish, yet the inward man is renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, works for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. The things that are seen are temporary. The things that are not seen are eternal. You see, humanly, we're running down. The outward man perishes. I don't care how much diet and how careful you are with exercise. You're not going to last forever. I read an article a number of years ago on Senator Strom Thurmond, who died recently. He was age 100 and just retired from the Senate. I read an article. This was way back in the 1960s. It was when he turned 65. And he did something pretty impressive when he turned 65. He called reporters into his office to show them how physically fit he was, and he proceeded to do 100 push-ups. And this magazine article, talked about how he had been, very careful about diet and exercise from the time he was a young man. And it talked about, his diet. And that was uncommon back in the 60s, that somebody was, avoiding a lot of these things and was eating, whole wheat and avoiding fatty foods and things like that. And he was really into diet and exercise, took good care of himself. Well, that's great, and I'm sure he lived longer and stayed in better health than he may have otherwise. But he died. The outward man still perished. I don't care how good a care you can take of yourself, you're not going to endure forever. The outward man perishes. Maybe 50, 60, 70 years, maybe 80 or 90 or even 100 years. We're, really impressed. Somebody lived to be 100. Well, that's great. But the outward man perishes. But there's something that is permanent. The outward man perishes, it returns to the dust of the ground, and time goes by, and eventually you can come back and, just turn back to dust. But the inward man is renewed day by day. There is something permanent that can be developed in you that will endure. Part of the way it's developed is our light affliction, which is but for a moment. Now, when you're going through your affliction, it often seems neither light nor momentary. You ever notice that? When you're in the middle of it, it seems like it's going to last forever. It's the worst thing that's ever been, and it's just going to last forever. And yet, God calls it a light affliction, but for a moment. Look back in your life. You remember something very difficult, maybe some particular trial or terrible thing that you went through. Maybe it's been a number of years ago, maybe 15 years, 20 years, 25 years. If you look back in your life, something that at the moment seemed like, I don't see how I'm going to endure this. I just can't go through this. This is, it just seemed like it was lasting forever. Now as you look back and it was 20, 25 years ago, it doesn't seem like it lasted nearly as long as it seemed like it was lasting at the time you were going through it. It doesn't seem quite as heavy, doesn't seem quite as long, because if things have changed since then, your perspective has changed. What is it that you and I are going through right now that we're going to look back on 100 years into the future, 1,000 years into the future, that's not going to seem, by comparison, light and momentary? God is after something permanent in you and in me. In the midst of a changing, transitory world, God is after something permanent. Now, the only way to do that is you've got to look at the things that are not seen. When I was drifting down the coast, there were things that were visible to my eye that seemed permanent. Now, they weren't really permanent, because within a matter of hours, the bus drove away and it wasn't there anymore. Or the volleyball nets were moved. You can't just look to anchor yourself in life. You can't just look at the things you can see. There were those who at one time thought that all they had to do was hang on to the institution of the church or the college. That was simple. They knew where they ought to be. They'd just be there. That was permanent, right? Well, the spiritual part is permanent. The truth is permanent. But the outward visible things that we see obviously can change. See, you've got to look at the things that are not seen, the things that are eternal, the things that are permanent, the things that are right and wrong, the values of God. Because there's a whole society that is in the process of passing away. This world and the lust thereof, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, lust of the flesh. Those are the underpinnings of a society that is going to pass away. And those who embrace values that are in the process of passing away, they'll pass away with them. If you want to stick around forever, you've got to embrace what's going to be here forever. God gives us a basis as we look at knowing what's permanent. He tells us in Galatians 6, verse 9, let's not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. You know, one of the things that can happen is we get tired, because we're physical. We get tired. We can become weary in well-doing. There are things that can cause a person to change in a wrong way. Solomon was enticed into pursuing ever-increasing self-indulgence. He was king. He was rich. There was a time of peace, a time of prosperity. He could indulge himself. And so he did. And one indulgence led to another. And, eventually he had indulged himself in 1,000 women. And of course, they had their demands. Well, time went by and they began to whine and wheedle. Well, why can't we have something over here for my God? And so, he gives in to that and he does that. And then the next one comes along, well, you built one for her, and why won't you build one for me? And so he did that, and then they wanted him to go with them. And Solomon, step by step, he didn't just do it all, just flip-flop from one day to the next. He gave in and he compromised. He had put himself in a situation. He was indulging the self. He was indulging the self. And the more he indulged the self, eventually that self-indulgence took him in a direction that was very displeasing to God. Now, self-indulgence can take us the wrong way. We live in a world that's based on self-indulgence, based on lust and pride. Another thing that can take us the wrong way is simply get tired of doing what's right. One lesson a farmer learns is you can't harvest until it becomes due season. We're in an age of instant everything. I mean, people don't even want to take a few minutes for something to cook. You can't just, cook oatmeal. You got to have instant oats. And so they get, you had quick oats and then you had instant oats and it just, it's got to be right now. Boy, we would go nuts having to go back to the world of our forefathers, where the recipe for chicken is first you got to catch the chicken, and you got to catch the chicken, and you also have got to split the wood up and build a fire. You got to get the fire going. You got to catch the chicken. You got to pluck him, and so it takes a little while. It's not. Taking the chicken tenders out of the freezer, popping them in the microwave and complaining because it takes 2 minutes and you don't see why it couldn't be done in 45 seconds. It's easy to get weary. Now, one of the things in just the cycles of life of a farmer is that you can't harvest until due season. You've got to wait until the time comes. I remember years ago when our boys were little. I think our oldest son was just a toddler, and we wanted to teach him something about growing. That's a fantastic thing that you can put a seed in the ground and here a plant comes up. And I think my wife had picked out for him. We had a little garden spot, and we're going to let him plant some sunflowers. because they come up, boy, and make a big, impressive plant. That's pretty impressive. And she was telling him, what we're going to do, and see this little seed, and we're going to put it in the ground, and it's going to come up this big sunflower. Showed him a picture of it and described it, and try to help him visualize what's going to take place. This is going to be great. Well, he goes out, we make this production, he plants his seed and everything. Well, he goes back a little later in the day, and doesn't look any different than it did when he put it in there. It's just sort of the dirt, and you can't see anything. I don't know. He went back the next day, and he may have lasted 2 or 3 days. I don't think he lasted any longer than that. But after a day or two, he goes back. The next thing, he's out there digging it up because he wants to find out what happened to it. He didn't, all this sounds like a far-fetched tale. He doesn't see anything but a seed. Hadn't waited long enough. In life, if we're going to participate in the spiritual harvest that God is producing, we're told, let's not be weary in well-doing. In due season, we will reap if we don't faint, if we don't give up and quit. Christ said, he that endures to the end, the same shall be saved. He didn't say those that endure almost to the end, or those, you go out and you read the parable of the workers in the vineyard. And the owner of the vineyard came out early in the morning, about 6 o'clock, and he looked out at the labor pool, and he said, you want to work in my vineyard? And he told them what he'd pay them, and they went out to work in the vineyard. A little while later, about 9 o'clock, he came back, and he saw some others, and he said, I need more workers in the vineyard. I'll hire you. They went out to work in the vineyard. About noon, he came back. Later on in the afternoon, finally, about 5 o'clock, final hour, he came back, and he was still looking for more workers. Sent them out there. And finally, when the time came, he went and he took the workers in the vineyard and he rewarded them. There's no indication in the parable that any of the workers were rewarded if they decided about noon, well, I think I've already been working in the vineyard 6 hours. I think I'm going to take it to the house. The only ones who received the reward were the ones who were working in the vineyard when the master came. The issue, of course, was, did you come when the master called? And did you remain faithfully so doing until the master came? We have to continue. Not allow weariness, not allow distraction. Those are the two things, I think, that are the most easy to take us to change in a negative way. We're either distracted and enticed by the world around, or we simply get tired because of the pressures that are on us and just the natural things that go on. We get weary in well-doing. You have to keep your eyes on what's permanent, what's real. That enables us to endure. That enables us to change. God said back in Malachi 3:6, the statement, God says, I am the Lord, I change not. Now, the context of it is the fact that Israel had changed. God had made a covenant with Israel, and Israel had departed. They were treacherous. The difference between God and Israel is they were treacherous, and God says, I'm the Lord, I change not. Therefore, you sons of Jacob are not consumed. Hebrews 13:8, Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. You read the whole context of the book of Hebrews, and you read about a book that's written in the closing years just prior to 70 A.D. and the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. And in the context of a world that was going to rapidly be in transition, their whole world from a religious standpoint was going to turn upside down because the temple was going to disappear, Jerusalem was going to disappear, the Jerusalem church was going to have to flee. All of the ceremonies of the Old Testament that they could see being carried out day by day in the temple in Jerusalem were going to cease. And Paul makes the point in Hebrews 13, here we have no continuing city, but we seek one that is to come. We're not looking for permanence in this age. What's permanent is the fact that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. There are those things that are permanent. There are values that are permanent. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 13, chapter 13, verse 13. He said, now abides faith, hope, and love. These three. The greatest of these is love. He talked about other things were going to pass away. He said, knowledge, it's temporary. Prophecy is temporary. I mean, eventually prophecy becomes history, doesn't it? Jonah made a prophecy of Nineveh that wasn't fulfilled because the people repented. Paul makes the statement in Hebrews 13. He shows that there are things that are permanent. There are things that are eternal. Now abide. Now continue. Now endure. Faith, hope, and love. There are values that are permanent. There's only one source of the permanent. And that source is this book. Because this book comes from God. And God doesn't change. James describes God as the Father of lights, with whom there's no variableness, neither shadow of turning. James chapter 1, verse 17. Every good and every perfect gift comes down from above, from the Father of lights, with whom there's no variableness, neither shadow of turning. God is not into evolving standards. God has not come up with a different set of standards than what He inspired Paul to write in the epistles, or what He inspired Moses to write 1,500 years before that. You and I live in a world of change, a world that is in transition, and we're going to see far greater changes, a time of upheaval. There's only one way for us to have stability in such a time. That comes from utilizing the knowledge and the wisdom that comes from this book. You and I can make our changes in the right direction. In other words, changes that take us closer to God. Changes that are not the result of drifting with the world, but of seeking to be transformed to be like our Father and our elder brother. Because we're utilizing this permanent standard to evaluate our lives by. As you look at your life, and you look back over recent years, it's good sometimes to stop and think about what changes have you made in your life. What do you do differently now than maybe you did when you first came in the church, or maybe than you did 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years ago? What changes? Then to look at those changes and say, are the changes that I've made, have I made them because they're taking me in the direction of becoming more like God? Or have in some cases I just gotten a little weary in well-doing and just found it easier to drift with the world, not going as fast or as far, but nevertheless going in that direction? Because that's something that you and I have to evaluate in our own lives. What direction are we going? See, it's not just a question of how rapidly are you changing. The question really, the more fundamental question, is what direction are we going? What direction are the changes in your life taking? That's something that all of us need to continue to look at. And the only way to really evaluate it is to look at this permanent record, to look at what's permanent, what's eternal, and look and compare the direction of our lives in terms of whether we're coming closer to this permanent standard or whether we are gradually drifting downstream. This world is rapidly changing, not just in terms of technology, but in many other ways as well. You and I are looking to be part of something that is permanent and enduring, something that is based on the unchangeable ways of the everlasting God.